concerns about Russia's threat to the West are as high as they were at the end of the Cold War. The United States is moving in artillery and troops to the Baltic states and Poland, and in response, Russia has threatened to move in nuclear-capable missiles to the area as well. It's a really tense time to be in the Baltic states right now. Basically what you're seeing is a large standoff between global superpowers. Tensions have been building between Russia and the US and its allies for years. Both sides have amped up their military along this border ever since Russia took over the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine, an independent nation. We went on a military exercise in Lithuania involving troops from several countries called Flaming Thunder 2016 to see what was being done to prevent a Russian attack. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was started after World War II, and it's a group of 28 countries that carry out military operations around the world. NATO was first created to protect Europe from the Soviet Union, what is now mostly Russia. Now it's official. With drones, howitzers, tanks, and artillery, it was pretty clear these elite forces were flexing their military muscle to send a message. Neither NATO nor the Russians have been willing to back down, straining an already tense relationship between Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Obama. Putin has been running the Russian Federation for the better part of 16 years, and many are concerned he wants to increase his power. So what's the purpose of this exercise?
You know, we're out here, we get to work with NATO partners, kind of see how they do things, show them how we do things, and just kind of build that NATO relationship.
The Baltic countries are kind of in a little corridor between Kaliningrad, Russian territory, and mainland Russia. Do you think that because of that geographic location, they're at an increased risk of more aggression?
You know, I can't comment to that. I think the Baltic states want to ensure that they have a free way of life and that they continue to be self-governing. So when the U.S. is here, basically to support that, and we will continue to do so.
That's our chopper!
To understand the sheer scale of this operation, we were taken up in a medevac chopper.
It's pretty amazing to see a NATO military exercise like this, but when Russia sees it, they perceive it as a threat of war. In fact, in 2015, they listed NATO as one of the biggest threats to Moscow.
The exercise involved hundreds of soldiers from several NATO countries: Germany, Portugal, Lithuania, Latvia, and the United States. Ukraine, which is not part of NATO and is currently battling Russia, was there too. We talked to these soldiers, who had first-hand experience fighting Russia. Valuable intel for NATO.
I don't feel any warm feelings towards Russia. They came into our land and took it from us. We've encountered Russian tanks. They've used grenades, rockets, tanks. It was hard fighting the Russians.
The Baltics, in particular, have been a focal point for NATO because, just like Ukraine, these countries used to be part of the Soviet Union, whose power was based in Russia. And these countries still have large pro-Russian populations. Now, this small region may seem insignificant, but it's actually very important. Any flare-up here could have much larger consequences in the world. That's because the countries in NATO are bound to defend each other and must all step in if one member country is attacked. That technically means 28 countries would be dragged into a war with Russia if that were to happen. That's about the same number as the countries involved in World War I. And a war of such seismic proportions, understandably, has people along the border very anxious.
Estonia and Russia are neighbors, and it's really easy Russians to come over the border, so I live near the border. Sometimes it's really it's scary.
What do you think about Vladimir Putin?
He's a difficult person, I don't know. I don't like him, actually.
Do you think he's a president or a dictator?
Dictator.
Dictator, for sure. You said that pretty definitively.
Yeah, because I don't like him and he's so evil.
While we put on the bulletproof vests and saw live fire simulations, that's all they were, simulations. But what could happen to the world if this fighting becomes real? Lucas Borisovicius comes from a long line of service.
You have to be proud about yourself if you are in military.
His grandfather and his father were both soldiers. and now, although he's studying to become a lawyer, he may have to serve as well, but not by choice.
I cannot say that it's fear, that every day it could be a conflict. But when you see the conflicts in pro-Soviet area, you are thinking that you could be in this place as well.
Tensions between his home country of Lithuania and neighboring Russia are heating up, so Lithuania is drafting its citizens to the military. Lucas and his friend Laurinus are both eligible.
5 years ago, they would say this is nonsense, we don't need this. But now more and more people would say that they are concerned about the Russian thing, and that's why they are really support the draft.
The draft was put into place after Lithuania saw what was happening with the conflict in Ukraine. When Russia took over the Crimean Peninsula back in 2014, and still today, government troops are battling rebels supported by Russia in other parts of the country. Lithuania worries Russia will try to take their land too.
So this area is very strategic for Russia.
In the case of conflict with NATO, yes.
Gustina Zelenskas knows all too well what life would be like under Russian control. He grew up when Lithuania was part of the Soviet Union, with Russia as its power center, and the United States was enemy number one. It started after World War II, the deadliest military conflict in history. Europe was in ruins, and two new world powers emerged, basically splitting the world in half. The Soviet Union and nations under its control, and America and NATO, the military alliance of 28 nations. In between was a boundary known as the Iron Curtain. It prevented travel and the spread of information between the Soviet Union and the West. The divide pitted American culture against communism.
I very well remember the lesson at school when the teacher just asked kids, who's gonna attack Soviet Union? 2/3 said, United States gonna attack Soviet Union. That was very common way how the propaganda was constructed. I think nowadays in Russia it's almost the same.
Aside from being taught to hate the United States, people living under Soviet control had very little freedom. The government controlled almost every aspect of their lives, and they were closed off from the outside world.
We cannot speak about liberties, let's say liberties to unions, liberties to associations, freedom of press, freedom of speech. You can end in jail for one joke if it would touch upon Soviet Union's officials or whatever.
But most importantly, the Soviet Union and the United States were in a dangerous race to have the most nuclear warheads, the deadliest weapon known to man. Each side scrambled to make more and more powerful bombs in an attempt to get so strong that no one would mess with them. It was called a Cold War because while there was no fighting between the two superpowers, the fear of nuclear war became a part of everyday life. But in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and eventually turned into what is now Russia and surrounding countries. But for the first time in decades, the United States and Russia were no longer enemies. While Lithuania got its independence 25 years ago, Zelenskas fears losing that freedom, which he says would happen if Russia invaded his homeland.
Does it feel like a new Cold War?
From the point of view of Lithuania, more or less yes. Only this time we in a better side of the Iron Curtain than it was before.
But a Russian attack would have major consequences for the world too. Any attack by Russia on a NATO country would require the United States and its NATO allies to respond, which could lead to a global conflict. Both sides still have nuclear weapons. Russia has been linked to a number of cyber attacks against the US, including government websites and corporations. And this year, US intelligence agencies say Russia tried to influence the 2016 presidential election. I sat down with Secretary of State John Kerry, the highest-ranking advisor to President Obama on foreign policy, to get his take.
There's been escalating tension in the Baltics. Are we entering a new Cold War with Russia?
No, I don't believe so, and I certainly don't want to see us do that. I think it would be a terrible waste of energy. There are real tensions over Ukraine, over NATO and nuclear policy in the region. We have to work through those things, to sit down at the table and hammer out an understanding regarding those differences and try to find common ground where we can work. Because it is not a good thing for Russia or the United States to go back into a Cold War status. Everybody would be a loser.
As for Lucas and Laurinus, they're ready to do whatever it takes to protect the freedom they've experienced for their entire lives.
We should as well be prepared. That's what Lithuanians do. There are a lot of men who are preparing, they are training, and they are ready to fight for their families, for the country, and for Lithuania.
We're here in Estonia, and just several hundred feet that way is Russia, which means we're standing at a major fault line between Russia and the West. And understandably, people here are concerned about what's happening on both sides of the border. In the Estonian border town of Narva, you don't have to look hard to notice Russian influence. Signs are in Russian, most of the people speak only Russian, cars have Russian license plates, and that heavy influence has many concerned that Narva could be a target for an invasion by Russia. That's why NATO, the military alliance of 28 countries including the US, has zeroed in on this border. According to this sign, there's a major Russian military base just about 70 kilometers from here. The thing is, aside from the occasional no trespassing sign, there wasn't much to see. With all of the talks of NATO beefing up its troops, I'm kind of surprised to see that there are no tanks out here or any sort of establishment that says this is Estonia, this is Russia. This is all kind of vacant land. There's a couple small villages around here, but it seems completely plausible that if Russia really wanted to, they could totally come in and take over this land and there wouldn't even really be a fight. Even though the border isn't full of soldiers or tanks, Estonia and other parts of Europe are already under attack, but the battleground is digital.
All modern nations on a day-to-day basis are seeing a level of cyber attacks, a level of attempts on their electronic information infrastructure, and that's a baseline level that everyone's experiencing in the West.
Lisa Past works for the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, a group that advises NATO in the world of cyber warfare. She says perhaps Russia's greatest weapon isn't a bomb, but a computer, something Estonia learned back in 2007.
Estonia saw an unprecedented level of cyber attacks that were coordinated against both its government electronic infrastructure, but then also media outlets, banks, anything you're used to doing online.
That attack was just the beginning. In 2015, Russian hackers shut down a major energy grid in Ukraine, cutting power to more than 200,000 people. And of course, just recently in America, officials from the FBI, CIA, Department of Homeland Security, and other US intelligence said the Russian government tried to influence the American election by hacking Democratic National Committee emails and several state voter registration lists. But President-elect Donald Trump has said he doesn't trust the findings, and the Russian government has denied all involvement. Regardless, this pattern of aggressive attacks has raised concern over whether NATO is well enough prepared. Critics say they aren't. Would you say that NATO is prepared right now to handle a sophisticated cyber attack by an enemy?
It's a question to NATO headquarters.
You wouldn't be able to answer that?
It's a question to NATO headquarters.
Because they've been criticized for being underprepared for a sophisticated cyber attack.
What we can see is NATO increasingly recognizing the cyberspace as a domain of operations at this point.
NATO has added the cyber frontier to its list of battlegrounds, along with land, sea, and air.
Cyberspace right now is very similar to air in the First World War. We're still seeing nations and international organizations figure out how exactly it fits into everything else. And that was the case with the airplanes in the First World War.
Past sees a world where attacks combining malware, software that damages computers, skilled hackers, and heavy weaponry are the norm. Although she admits she doesn't know exactly what that world will look like.
The world has not seen a cyber attack that raises to the level of warfare.
But the idea of an attack on US soil is frightening. The US Government Accountability Office issued a warning in 2015 that parts of aircrafts could potentially be hacked and controlled remotely. And a recent survey from Black & Veatch, energy industry consultants, found that only about a third of US electric utility companies could fight off a cyber attack.
The offensive and defensive capabilities of different parties have just developed so incredibly fast. Whether that ends up being an arms race or whether that ends up actually being deterrence, no one wants to push the red button first.
If the new battleground is online, many are wondering, is cyber warfare a safer fight or more deadly than we could ever know? Trump says the Obama administration's handling of Russia has been a disaster, and he wants to mend ties.
Wouldn't it be nice if we actually did get along with Russia?
Trump has praised Russian President Vladimir Putin as a leader, and Putin has also called Trump a bright person.
I think I'd get along very well with Vladimir Putin.
Over Christmas, he received a card from the Russian president himself. And President-elect Trump continues to question reports by U.S. intelligence agencies, saying he doesn't believe that Russia hacked the U.S. election in order to help get him elected. Trump's friendly approach toward Putin and Russia has some people worried. In Europe, leaders are on edge, anxious that Trump's outreach to Putin could make Russia more powerful without America holding it in check. Many Europeans also fear that President-elect Trump will back out of several historic agreements and pull the U.S. out of NATO, the military alliance meant to protect European nations. Trump has suggested leaving NATO, but later he assured President Obama that he would stand by the alliance.
I am encouraged by the President-elect's insistence that NATO is a commitment that does not change.
And as much as there is friendly talk, both Putin and Trump have threatened recently to expand their country's nuclear capabilities, stoking fears of a new Cold War, where both sides build up their weapons, reversing years of agreements to cut back on nuclear arsenals. But with all the concern, there are some that think Trump's more cooperative attitude toward Russia could help the U.S. going forward.
I'm hopeful that Trump, in a wise way, can turn over a new leaf and not be naive about Putin doing us any favors, but still try to take some of the venom out of the relationship.
And President-elect Trump hasn't outlined publicly any details about his plans for Russia, only saying he wants to mend ties. And you know what, Ariel? We asked him and his team for more info on his plans, but they did not get back to us by our deadline. What happens next between the U.S. and Russia will have a big impact not just here, but in Europe and even the conflict in Syria, where the U.S. and Russia have butted heads. So lots at stake.
That is so right, Tom. And President-elect Trump takes over exactly 2 weeks from today on January 20th, so we have a lot to look forward to. Thanks, Tom.